The shuttle was small, it had no weapons, that was the point. Earth's council had been very clear about that when they assigned Elias Voss to the diplomatic run through Vethari space. A retired admiral, one ship, no guns, no escort. The message it sent to the Galactic Conclave was supposed to be something like "We trust you," or maybe "We are not afraid." Voss had read the briefing notes on the flight out and decided the message it actually sent was closer to "We are not paying close enough attention." He was 79 years old. His knees were bad. His left ear was worse. He wore a small hearing aid in that ear, a plain gray thing, and he had a habit of taking it out when people were saying things he did not feel like hearing. He had used that habit a great deal in diplomatic meetings over the years. The shuttle had 7 people on board, including the pilot. A small crew, specialists mostly, with soft hands and clean uniforms and the kind of careful voices people use when they are very aware they are far from home. Voss liked them well enough. He had spent the first 2 days of the transit reading old paper books and drinking bad coffee and not talking much, which was how he preferred things. He was reading when they came. There was no alarm. That was the first wrong thing. The second wrong thing was the sound the docking clamp made, too heavy, too fast, nothing like a standard approach. Voss had spent 40 years on ships. He knew what a standard approach sounded like. He put his book down. He put his hearing aid in his breast pocket. The boarding door came open 4 minutes later. By that point, Voss was standing in the corridor with his hands visible and his face doing nothing in particular. The Vethari soldiers who came through were tall and pale and moved like people who had done this before and found it dull. There were 8 of them. They had weapons that looked like they had never needed to be fired because simply holding them had always been enough. One of them said something. The translation unit on Voss's collar rendered it as, "Remain still and no harm will occur." Voss remained still. The crew was gathered quickly and efficiently into the main cabin. Nobody was hurt. Nobody was spoken to beyond the basic commands. The whole thing had the feeling of a task being completed, a box being checked, something administrative. Voss watched the soldiers move through the shuttle and thought about the word *efficient and what it usually meant when it was applied to violence. One of the younger soldiers, thin, with the pale blue bioluminescence running along his jaw that marked the Vethari young, went through the personal quarters. Methodical, opening compartments, scanning, moving on. He got to Voss's bunk. There was not much there. A duffel bag, a second pair of boots, a coffee-stained paperback wedged against the wall, and fixed to the bunk panel with a strip of Velcro because frames and shelves were bad ideas on ships, a photograph. 3 rows of people, summer light. A house somewhere in Oregon with a porch that needed painting. His daughter, her husband, their kids, their kids' kids. Dara second from the left in the back row, squinting against the sun, already standing the way soldiers stand even when they're at a family barbecue, weight balanced, shoulders set, some part of her always ready. The soldier pulled the photograph off the panel. He turned it over, looked at the front, looked at the back, turned it over again. The way someone looks at a thing when they are not sure if it is valuable or not and are deciding whether to put it back. He did not put it back. He slid it into his vest pocket and moved to the next compartment. Voss watched this happen. His hands, the arthritic ones with the swollen knuckles and the 2 fingers that didn't fully straighten anymore, closed into fists at his sides. He unclenched them. Slowly, 1 finger at a time. He had learned a long time ago that there was a math to when to spend yourself. And the math right now, 8 guns and a stolen photograph in a corridor he could not fight his way out of, said to wait. The math had said that before. It had said it at Kepler Corridor 2, where he had ordered the retreat and 4,000 people had followed that order and 200 of them had made it. The math was not always a comfortable thing to be right about. He unclenched his hands. He said nothing. Hell of a thing. The cell they put him in was at the lower level of the Vethari command vessel. It was clean and cold and entirely built for a species that was taller than him, which meant the single flat shelf along the wall that was presumably a sleeping surface was at a height that would require him to climb into it. There was no chair. The floor was bare metal. Voss sat on the floor. He sat cross-legged against the wall and looked at the cell door and listened to the sounds of the ship around him. It did not sound like any ship he had served on. The engine rhythm was different, smoother, with a pulse underneath it that his old ships had never had. The crew movements above him were precise and evenly spaced, like a schedule being kept to the minute. He noted the layout of sounds the way he had always noted the layout of rooms, where things were, how they moved, how long between cycles. After a while, when the corridor outside had gone quiet and the ship had settled into its transit rhythm, he reached into his breast pocket. He took out the hearing aid. He put it back in his left ear. Then he just sat there in the cold and the silence and listened to the ship move through the dark. It had good bones, he would give them that. The engineering had a kind of confidence in it, the design of something built by people who had not worried about being attacked for a very long time. That was a thing about a long piece. It made people build differently. It made them build like permanence was guaranteed, like the future was already settled. He knew something about futures that seemed settled. He had stood in the wreckage of several. He put his head back against the wall and closed his eyes, and somewhere in the hull around him, the ship moved deeper into Vethari space, carrying him toward whatever theater they had planned. And Voss breathed slowly and thought about the sound a signal makes when it travels, and about a granddaughter who would read it right. She always read things right. He had made sure of that. Hell of a thing to have built. The grand conclave chamber had been built to make things feel small. It was not accidental. The ceiling rose so high that the upper air was actually hazy, a thin atmospheric layer hanging above the delicate tiers like weather. The walls curved inward at the top, which made the room feel like the inside of something organic, like being swallowed. The acoustics were engineered so that your own voice came back to you a half-second later, quieter than it left, as if the room itself was correcting you. 47 species sat in the tiers. Delegates, observers, advisors, scribes. The Vethari filled the top levels, their bioluminescence making the upper reaches glow a soft, cold blue. The lower tiers held the smaller species, the dimmer ones, the ones who had learned long ago that sitting closer to the floor was just how things were arranged. Elias Voss was brought in through the floor-level entrance. He was the shortest thing in the room by a significant margin. He was also, by any fair accounting, the oldest. He walked without a guard's hand on him. They had stopped bothering with that somewhere around the second day, when it became clear he was not going to run anywhere, and he walked at his own pace, which was not fast because his knees were bad and the floor of the chamber was a polished stone that was slightly slick, and he was not going to fall down in front of 47 species if he could help it. He reached the center of the chamber floor. He stood there. The gallery rippled. The bioluminescence in the upper tiers pulsed in a synchronized wave, blue going to white going to blue again, the way a crowd ripples when something amusing happens, when something small and harmless walks into a room that was built for things that matter. He had seen that kind of light before, different species, same meaning. He did not look up at the light. Councillor Vrethkaz opened the session from his position at the head of the primary tier. He was old, even by Vethari standards, which meant 4 centuries of accumulated certainty. His voice had the smooth, unhurried quality of someone who had never needed to rush anything because time had always agreed to wait. He stated the conclave's position. It took a while. The conclave's position, rendered into basic translation, was this: humanity had been expanding its territory without authorization. Humanity had been building military infrastructure that exceeded the agreements established under the Outer Systems Treaty. Humanity had been behaving in some, as though the conclave's boundaries were suggestions rather than law. The conclave found this, Vrethkaz said, regrettable. Then a younger counselor, 2 seats to the left, leaned toward his speaker and said something that the translation unit rendered as, "They sent us a relic." The upper tiers pulsed again, white this time, brighter. Voss stood in the center of the floor and let it happen. He reached into his breast pocket. He took out his hearing aid. He held it in his fingers for a moment, placed it carefully in his pocket. He waited. He stood still in the center of the chamber with the laughter cycling through the tiers above him, all that light pulsing and rippling, and he waited with the specific patience of a man who had a lot of practice at waiting, and had learned that it was one of the few things that genuinely unsettled people who were used to getting reactions. When the light settled, he reached into his pocket, put the hearing aid back in, looked up at Vrethkaz. "You done?" he asked. The translation unit carried it up through the chamber. The room went very quiet, not the managed silence of a formal proceeding, the real kind. The kind that happens when something does not behave the way the room expected it to behave. Vrethkaz recovered smoothly. He said the session had barely begun. Voss nodded. He looked around the chamber slowly, the way a man looks around a new room when he is deciding where things are. He took his time. Nobody rushed him and he did not rush himself. "I want to tell you something about Kepler Corridor," he said. He did not say it like a story. He said it like a man reading numbers off a page. 40 years ago, he told them. Bad sector. Terrible terrain for human ships. The Conclave's member species in that region had pulled their fleets back. A political calculation, nothing personal, just the math of not wanting to spend resources on something that looked like a losing position. The assessment had been that the human forces would scatter, regroup elsewhere, do what losing forces do. The last human unit standing in Kepler Corridor had held the line for 11 days. 11 days with no resupply, no relief, no realistic expectation of survival. The unit had been crewed by people who had every biological reason to stop. Exhausted people, hurt people, people who had been awake for so long that the line between what was real and what their minds were inventing had become a thing they just worked around. They had held the corridor anyway. Tired people, Voss said, outgunned people. He let that sit in the room for a moment. "You should have been watching us back then," he said, "instead of now." Vrethkaz made a sound that translated as patient indulgence. He said the conclave was familiar with the Kepler incident. He said that a single engagement, however remarkable, was not a basis for policy equivalence. He said that humanity's history of persistence was noted, and frankly, expected. It was a trait of younger species to overinvest in individual engagements because they lacked the strategic maturity to see the full scale. The gallery pulsed in agreement. Voss listened to the translation. He looked at the floor for a moment. Then he looked back up. "You took my picture," he said. The room did not know what to do with that. Several translators checked their units. "The photograph from my bunk, your soldier took it." He was not angry when he said it. His voice had exactly the same register it had held for the last 5 minutes, flat, factual, the tone of a man giving a weather report. "That photograph has 4 of my grandchildren in it. One of them is currently commanding a fleet vessel. She is very good at her job." He paused. "You want war." He said it quietly. The kind of quiet that is not the absence of sound, but the absence of anything else. "We will give you war." That sentence stood alone in the chamber. It did not carry threat in the traditional way, no volume, no dramatic weight, no clenched jaw behind it. It sat there the way a bill sits on a table, already calculated, already settled. The amount was not up for discussion. The upper tiers took a moment to respond. When the laughter came, it was less unified than before. A few delegates did not pulse at all. Vreth moved the session forward. Procedural matters, the terms under which Voss would be held pending resolution, the framework for renewed treaty discussion. In the back tier, in the highest row, a single delegate from a species that had no common name in human records sat very still. He was old. His species measured age differently, not in years but in conflicts survived. He had survived 7. He had seen the thing in Voss's eyes that the rest of the chamber had missed, because they had been watching for something louder. He sat still and said nothing, and did not pulse with the rest. Voss was escorted back out through the floor-level entrance. In the corridor, walking back toward the cell block, he reached into his pocket, took out the hearing aid, held it a moment in his arthritic hand. 2 fingers on his right hand pressed together, held, released. A small gesture, private, the kind of thing a man does when he is working out a cramp. In his chest, pressed against his sternum under his shirt, a device no larger than a coin registered the press of those 2 fingers and began doing what it had been built to do. He put his hearing aid back in. Kept walking. Hell of a thing to have waited for. The signal arrived at Cascadia Station at 3:14 hours, station time, which was deep in the part of the night when the corridors were dim, and the duty staff were on their 3rd coffee, and the kind of tired that makes even simple things feel slightly unreal. Commander Dara Voss was in a briefing room on level 4, going over logistics reports for a resupply chain issue that was not urgent but was the kind of problem that ate your calendar if you let it. She was not thinking about her grandfather. She had made a decision, 3 weeks earlier when the diplomatic shuttle stopped responding to routine check-ins, to not think about her grandfather during work hours, because thinking about him during work hours made her useless, and she could not afford to be useless. Her secondary screen pinged. She looked at it. The signal was 2 words in Old Fleet shorthand, a code that predated the current communication protocols by 30 years, a code that technically no longer existed in any active manual. She knew it anyway. He had made sure she knew it, sitting at a kitchen table in Oregon when she was 14 years old, drilling her on fleet codes the way other grandfathers drilled grandchildren on multiplication tables. You never know what you'll need, he had told her. Learn the old things. Nobody expects the old things. She stared at the screen. The code was not a distress signal. It was not a capture code or a surrender code or any of the codes that meant things were going badly. It was an initiation code, an old, specific word that meant one thing and had always meant one thing. Begin. She turned to the officer sitting beside her. Lieutenant Marsh, 26 years old, very good at logistics, currently explaining something about fuel allocation. Get Admiral Caro, she said. Right now, don't tell him why. She turned back to the screen. The signal had a timestamp. She did the math on when it was sent, and what that meant about where her grandfather had been when he sent it, and what he must have done in the 12 hours before sending it, and the math assembled itself into a picture she held in her head for exactly 3 seconds before she put it down. She opened a new file on her screen. She started a list. Admiral Caro arrived in 14 minutes, which meant he had been asleep and had dressed in a hurry because his collar was 1 button off. He was a large man, gray-haired, with the kind of face that did not show much. He looked at the screen. He looked at Dara. That's a real code, he said. Yes, sir. From Voss. Yes, sir. He was quiet for a moment. He's in a Vethari cell. Yes, sir, he sent it from there. Caro looked at the code again. He had been in the fleet long enough to know what initiation codes meant. He had also been in the fleet long enough to know that they were not sent casually, not by anyone, and certainly not by Elias Voss, who Caro had served under for 6 years and who did not do anything casually. How long ago did this come in? 11 minutes. Who else has seen it? Right now, us. Caro put his hand flat on the table. He was doing the math the same way she had done it, going through the same set of calculations. And she watched his face arrive at the same picture. "Wake the council," he said. "Already sent the request, sir." "Get me fleet status on." "Already pulled, sir. It's the second file on your secondary screen." He looked at her. "You've been busy in 11 minutes, he said. "I make lists," she said, "when I need to not do something else." He understood what she meant. He didn't push it. The fleet status was something that the Galactic Conclave had never seen in its complete form, because humanity had made a quiet and consistent decision over the last 3 decades to show the Conclave approximately 60% of what existed. Not out of aggression, out of the specific wisdom of people who remembered what happened when you put everything on the table. Dara's list itemized what was not on the treaty declarations. 34 active fleet carriers. The Meridian Line, 7 jumpgate relays threaded through dead star systems, built in the dark over 15 years by crews under orders that did not officially exist. Weapons systems with project names that sounded administrative and were not. And at the bottom of the list, one line she had pulled from a file classified above her own clearance, because her grandfather had given her an access code on that same Oregon afternoon and told her if you ever need it, you'll know. Project Longtooth. No further description available at her access level. She knew what names like that meant. She had worked in Fleet Command long enough to understand that the projects with the quiet names were never the ones you hoped you'd never use. They were the ones you hoped the existence of would be enough. She read the last line of the list twice. Veteran Mobilization Index, 94%. 94% of Earth's combat veterans, retired, discharged, reassigned to civilian roles, sitting behind desks, running farms, teaching school, some of them with bad knees and hearing aids and arthritic hands, had pre-registered for reactivation under Article 7. Article 7 was 2 sentences long. It had been written quietly into the Defense Charter 8 years ago by a committee that had included her grandfather, who had sat in those meetings and said very little and made sure those 2 sentences ended up in the final document. In the event that a human citizen is unlawfully detained by a foreign power, all prior service personnel are eligible for immediate reactivation at their last held rank. Service is voluntary. Response time is assumed to be immediate. 94%. She stood up from the table. She went to the window that looked out over the station's main deck. Below, the deck crews were already moving, not running, not making noise, just moving with that specific, quiet, heads-down quality of people who have already been told and did not need to be told twice. Ships were being prepped at the docking arms, fuel lines going in, cargo being loaded with fast, efficient hands. Some of the pilots walking toward their assigned vessels were older, gray-haired, moving a little slower than the young ones, wearing gear that was freshly issued but carrying themselves like people who had worn gear before and were not surprised by the weight of it. She watched an old woman, 60s at least, walk up the ramp of a Scout-class vessel without looking back. Straight spine, easy stride, the walk of someone going somewhere she had already decided to go. Tired people, her grandfather had said at her kitchen table once, a long time ago when she had asked him about Kepler Corridor. She had been 16. She had wanted a real answer, not the public one. Outgunned people, people with every reason to stop. She had asked why they didn't stop. He had thought about it for a long time. Because stopping felt worse, he had finally said. There's a kind of tired where stopping doesn't feel like rest anymore. It just feels like a different kind of hurt. So you keep going. She had not fully understood it then. She looked at the old woman walking up the ramp. She understood it now. She did not let herself finish the thought that came after. She went back to her table. She opened a new page. She started another list. In the Conclave's Strategic Analysis Center, 3 sectors away, a junior analyst was reviewing routine sensor data from the human border. Anomalous readings at 17 points. Faint. Could be equipment drift. Could be interference from the dead star systems along the meridian sectors, which were known to produce unusual readings. She flagged it as asterisk probable equipment malfunction and moved to the next item. The report went into Vrethkaz's queue. He read it the next morning. He noted it. He filed it. Probable malfunction. Asterisk he wrote beside it and closed the file and went to his next meeting, which was about something entirely different and seemed, at the time, like the more important thing. The Vethari border station at Orvith Crossing had been a conclave installation for 200 years. It had been built to be permanent. The architecture said so: thick walls, deep foundations driven into the rock of the asteroid it was anchored to, a design that spoke of confidence in the future. The station commander had served there for 11 years, and in that time nothing had happened that required the kind of attention that disturbs sleep. At 600 hours, station time, a series of contacts appeared on the perimeter sensors. Small ships, fast ones, coming in from a direction that the sensor array was not primarily oriented toward, because nothing had ever come from that direction before. The station commander sent a challenge signal, standard protocol. He expected a response within 30 seconds. He did not get one. At 6:11 hours, the Orvith Crossing station stopped transmitting. The whole process had taken 11 minutes. There were no fleet carriers in the opening wave. No heavy ships, nothing that looked like what the Conclave's intelligence files categorized as a human military asset. The vessels that moved along the Vethari border in those first hours were small and fast and flew without formation, without the organized structure that military doctrine across a dozen species said an attacking force should have. They moved like water moving through cracks. They went where the gaps were. Some of the ships were old, the kind of old that showed in the hull profiles, angular where modern builds were smooth, carrying the aesthetic of an earlier decade's engineering. Inside them, the pre-flight checklists were printed on actual paper. Some of the pilots had to adjust their seats to accommodate the particular way their bodies had changed since the last time they had sat in a cockpit. One pilot, 64 years old, formerly of the 9th Deep Range Wing, spent 40 seconds before her jump sequence trying to remember if she had taken her blood pressure medication that morning, and decided it did not matter and jumped anyway. She had very good hands. She had always had very good hands. The Meridian Line activated 6 hours into the operation. 7 jump gate relays, built in the dark, threading through star systems that the Conclave had surveyed once and stopped caring about because there was nothing in them worth caring about. The relays had been constructed over 15 years by people under orders that did not appear in any document the Conclave had access to. The workers who built them had called them, informally, the back roads, which was a very human way to describe something that was, technically, a major feat of engineering. Human vessels began coming through the back roads and into Conclave interior space before the Conclave understood there were back roads. The first intelligence report reached Vrethkaz at 900 hours. 4 border installations, all silent. The analyst's recommendation was a defensive posture and a formal inquiry through diplomatic channels. Vrethkaz approved the defensive posture. He did not approve the diplomatic inquiry, yet, because diplomatic inquiries carried implications, he was not ready to commit to in writing. He was not worried. 4 border installations going dark was unusual but not catastrophic. The humans were making a demonstration. That was how young species processed grievance, through gesture, through the performance of force, through the need to be seen as serious. The appropriate response was measured patience. Make them spend themselves on gestures. Wait for them to need something, because young species always needed something, and when they did, negotiate from position. The second report came at 1400 hours. 17 installations. The Meridian Line, interior space. Vrethkaz read the report 3 times. The Meridian Line should not have existed. The dead star systems along that corridor had been surveyed. There was nothing there. There had never been anything there. He called for a full sensor sweep of the relevant sectors. The sensors that would have conducted the sweep were no longer transmitting. The Conclave's Strategic Analysis Center began producing reports with the kind of frequency that is itself a piece of information. Each one was longer than the last. Each one revised the previous one's numbers upward. 31 installations now, then 44. The humans were not targeting military assets alone, which was what the Conclave's tactical models had expected. They were targeting communication infrastructure, relay stations, data nodes, the quiet, unglamorous architecture of how a civilization talks to itself. The Conclave was going blind. Not dark, there were still channels, still connections, but the kind of blind that comes from losing enough peripheral vision that you keep turning to look at things and finding them gone. A senior analyst submitted a revised threat assessment. The document was thorough. It included fleet projections, asset comparisons, estimated engagement timelines. At the bottom, almost as a footnote, was a note the analyst had added and then almost deleted and then decided to leave. The mobilization index includes a significant number of reactivated veteran personnel. Current threat assessment algorithms have been filtering these assets as low capability due to age and time removed from service. Recommend manual review. Algorithm may be underestimating. Nobody read the footnote that day. In the conclave chamber, the tone had changed. It had the specific changed tone of a room that is still performing calm, but is doing it with effort. Vrethkaz convened an emergency session. The delegates filled the tiers faster than they had for the formal session. No rippling bioluminescence this time, no casual light, just people moving to their seats with the briskness of those who have been briefed on something they did not expect to be briefed on. Vrethkaz demanded to know the total number of human vessels engaged. The number his intelligence chief gave him was wrong. Not deliberately. The count was accurate for the vessels the conclave knew about, the ones from the treaty declarations, the 60% that had always been on the table. It did not count the ships coming through the Meridian Line. It did not count the old ships flown by old pilots that the threat assessment algorithm had decided were not worth counting. The number sounded manageable. Vrethkaz authorized a formal message to Earth Fleet Command. The message requested an immediate ceasefire. It used the language of mutual interest and collective stability, and the shared responsibility of advanced civilizations toward peace. It was the kind of message that the conclave sent when it wanted to reset a situation, without explicitly acknowledging that the situation had gotten away from it. The message was transmitted through the diplomatic channel that still worked. It arrived at Cascadia Station 40 minutes later. Dara read it at her desk standing, because she had been standing for most of the last 18 hours, and sitting felt wrong now. She set it down. She read it again. She thought about the photograph. 4 grandchildren in summer light, a porch that needed painting. She thought about an old man sitting on the metal floor of a cell on a ship that sounded like nothing he had ever served on. She picked the message back up. "Tell them," she said, to the duty officer standing 2 feet away, "that our negotiator is currently unavailable." The duty officer, young, careful, asked where the negotiator was. "Cell Block 7, Vethari Command Vessel 4. She put the message back on the table. "They know where to find him." Ilias Voss heard the ship change. He had been sitting on the floor of his cell for a long time. Not sleeping. He had not slept well since the Kepler corridor, and that had been 40 years ago, so he had made peace with not sleeping. He had been sitting and listening to the rhythms of the ship and cataloging them the way old habits make you catalog things without being asked to. The rhythm changed around hour 18. The engine pulse shifted, not much, but enough. The crew movements above him became faster, less evenly spaced, more of them at once. A door somewhere in the upper level opened and closed 4 times in quick succession. He recognized the shape of it. The specific shape of a ship where the people in charge have just been told something that required an immediate meeting. He did not smile. He was not a man who smiled at the math. He sat on the floor of his cold cell and put his hearing aid in and listened, and after a while he heard the sound that he had been waiting for without letting himself call it waiting. A frequency in the hull, faint, just at the edge of what his left ear could catch, the particular harmonic that big engines make when they begin to decelerate. They were slowing down. There it was. He pressed his hands flat against his knees, the arthritic ones, the ones with the 2 fingers that wouldn't straighten. Hell of a thing to be right about. They gave him back on a Thursday. That was how Dara thought about it afterward, not a formal return, not a diplomatic handoff, just a Thursday when a Vethari shuttle appeared at the designated neutral coordinates and docked, and the door opened, and Elias Voss walked off it under his own power. No ceremony, no statement read aloud. The Vethari crew did not come to the door. They sent him down the ramp and closed it behind him before he reached the bottom. He was still in the same clothes he had been wearing when they took him. The clothes were clean, which meant they had given him laundry and not much else. He was walking the way he always walked, a little slow, weight favoring the right knee, chin level, the slight forward lean of a man who has been somewhere and is heading somewhere else, and the space between is just mechanics. Cascadia Station's docking bay was full. People had come. Word had moved through the station the way it always moves when something has broken one way and not the other. Deck crew and officers and personnel from departments that had no official reason to be in the bay, all of them there anyway, and the room had the specific quality of sound that a crowd makes when it is not quite ready to be loud yet. Held breath, shuffled feet, the near silence of a lot of people waiting for something to become real. Voss came off the ramp. He looked around the bay. He found Dara in the crowd the way a person finds something they have been looking for while pretending not to look. She was near the back, off to the left, standing the way she always stood, weight balanced, shoulders set, with her hands clasped in front of her and her face doing the thing where she was making a list instead of whatever the other thing was. He walked toward her. She watched him come. She did the inventory she could not stop herself from doing, checking him against the version she had carried in her head for 3 weeks, noting the differences, the 3-week difference, cataloging it the way she cataloged things when she needed to not feel it yet. He stopped in front of her. "You could have just sent a strongly worded letter," he said. She hit his shoulder. Not gently, not hard, the exact specific force of someone who has a lot of feeling and has found one efficient way to express it. He absorbed it without moving. Around them the bay went loud. Not organized loud, not a cheer with a shape, just sound, the kind that comes out of a crowd when something is finally allowed to be real. He let it happen. He stood in the middle of it with his hands in his pockets and his bad knee and his hearing aid and his 3-week-old clothes, and he did not look like a man who had just been at the center of the largest military mobilization humanity had conducted in 30 years. He looked like a man who had been somewhere and was back now, and found the noise slightly excessive. Dara was still making her list. He could tell he had taught her that. He reached into his breast pocket. He took out the photograph. She looked at it. The Oregon photograph, summer light, the porch that needed painting. He held it for a moment before putting it back. He did not say anything about it. He did not need to. Vreth Kaz read the formal statement into the conclave record himself. His voice had lost something over the previous 2 weeks. Not volume, volume was easy, volume was controlled, but the quality underneath the volume, the 4 centuries of certainty that had been there so long it had become indistinguishable from the voice itself. It was still there. It was just not as invisible as it had been before. The conclave acknowledged the unauthorized detention of a human diplomatic representative. The conclave acknowledged miscalculation in the assessment of the territorial situation. The conclave committed to a full review of the Outer Systems Treaty under terms that would include direct human input. The word *unprecedented appeared 4 times. The word *miscalculation* appeared once, very carefully, in a sentence structured so that the miscalculation belonged to a process rather than to any specific person. What the statement did not say was everything it did not say. It did not mention the meridian line, because acknowledging it meant acknowledging they had not known it existed. It did not mention how many human installations had been counted versus how many had been found. It did not mention that the threat assessment algorithm had been revised 3 times in the last 10 days and was still producing numbers that the analysts were not confident in. It did not mention that the campaign had stopped, not because it had reached the edge of what humanity could do. It had stopped because humanity had decided to stop. That distinction was not in the statement, but Vrethkaz knew it, the way you know a thing in the part of your mind that you do not let talk too loudly in official sessions. He had sat with that knowledge for 10 days, and it had not gotten more comfortable with familiarity. The old delegate from the back tier, the one who had gone still in the chamber during Voss's speech, had sent him a private message afterward. Short, 3 sentences. You were not watching what they actually were. I have seen 7 wars. None of them looked like their beginning. Vrethkaz had not responded. He had read it many times. The Conclave archive received its updated entry on humanity 17 days after Voss walked off the ramp. The analyst assigned to the update had been working on it since the ceasefire. The task kept growing. There was always more to add: the meridian line, the veteran mobilization numbers, the tactical approaches that did not match any doctrine in the Conclave's classified library because they were not doctrine, they were improvisation. They were people who were very practiced at working with what they had and not waiting for what they wished they had. The analyst could document all of it: the fleet strength, the jump gate infrastructure, the weapons systems, the numbers. She kept getting stuck on the veterans. The algorithm problem, the assets that had been filtered out, counted as low capability, filed under *retired personnel and given a weight close to 0. She had gone back through the engagement data and recalculated. The reactivated veterans had accounted for 31% of the offensive action in the first 72 hours. Old ships, paper checklists, pilots who had had to adjust their seats. 31%. She tried to write the classification several different ways. She tried the clinical approach, personnel statistics, capability assessments, mobilization data. She tried the strategic approach, recommendations for future threat evaluation, suggestions for revised algorithmic parameters. Everything she wrote was technically accurate, and none of it captured the actual thing. She left it open for 2 days. On the 3rd day, she wrote a note and put it at the bottom of the file, below the statistics and the fleet counts and the coordinates. She wrote it in the section marked *additional analyst observations, which was a field that nobody read and which had no official weight. She wrote, "This species does not fight because it is powerful. Many species are powerful. This species fights because stopping, when the cause is theirs, appears to feel worse than continuing. The veterans who reactivated did so voluntarily, under no legal obligation, many at significant personal cost. The assessment algorithm marked them as low capability due to age. This was the wrong measurement. Age was not the relevant variable. The relevant variable appears to be decision. They do not stop because they are strong. They stop only when they decide to. We do not yet know what makes them decide. She looked at it for a long time. She left it in. Voss was on the station for 4 days before they moved him to a proper transport back to Earth. On the third night late, he found a bench in an empty corridor on the station's lower level. The bench was the wrong height for human sitting, built for a maintenance crew that had included species of varying sizes, and the angle was slightly off. He sat on it anyway. He took the photograph out. 3 rows of people, summer light. The porch that still needed painting 2 years after it had needed painting, because none of them ever seemed to be home at the same time long enough to do it. Dara, second row, squinting against the sun. He looked at the photograph for a while. He thought about Kepler Corridor the way he always thought about it, not the broad shape of it, the military history, the numbers that went into the official record, but the specific weight of a specific moment. The moment he had done the math and given the order. The 4,000 who had followed it. The 200 who had come back. He thought about Article 7, 94%. He thought about an old woman walking up a ramp without looking back. Tired people. He heard his own voice saying it in that cold, tall chamber. Outgunned people, people with every reason to stop. He had meant it as information. He had delivered it as information because that was what it was. The conclave had heard it as something else, as pride, as bluster, as the posturing of a species that did not understand how small it was. They had heard what they expected to hear. That was the thing about people who had not been surprised in a very long time. He put the photograph back in his breast pocket, same pocket as the hearing aid. The corridor was quiet. The station around him breathed its slow mechanical breath, the hum of it familiar in the way all ships and stations were familiar to him. The language of it, the grammar of engines and recycled air, and the small sounds of a thing that was working as it was supposed to work. He was tired in the specific way that had nothing to do with sleep. But it was the known kind, the kind he had learned to work around, the kind that was a different sort of hurt than the alternative. He sat on the wrong height bench in the empty corridor and did not move for a long time. Hell of a thing to still be.